I'm very honored to be speaking with Dexter Van Zile of Camera. What's your exact position name in the Camera?
I'm the Christian Media Analyst.
Christian Media Analyst for
Thanks.
Camera. I've read a lot of your stuff. It's really, really excellent. Great research and very impressive. How did you get into this entire scene of pro-Israel advocacy in Camera?
Well, first of all, I guess I was imbued with my father with a kind of almost a supernatural fear of anti-Semitism. He had served in World War II. He had lost his brother in Iwo Jima. He was set to invade Japan when they dropped the bomb. He was in the Philippines. And he understood that World War II was largely initiated as a result of anti-Semitism, at least in the European theater. And I think that he just thought anti-Semitism was a harbinger of totalitarianism, and he understood. And he wasn't a Christian Zionist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think he understood that anti-Semitism was a terrible evil. And when they passed the Zionism as racism resolution in '75, that made him very angry. And that was one of the things that I remembered about him as I got older. I also had a friend that I had met through Scouts who had talked to me a lot. He was an American Jew. He grew up in the Boston area, and he was a good friend of mine. And he taught me a lot about anti-Semitism. This was in the '80s, and one of the things he said was, "Oh, by the way, he talked to me about Christian supersessionism, and he said, "Oh, by the way, Islam has the same problem." And so when September 11th came along, I was prepared. I kind of understood that there was something going on more than what we had been told.
You mentioned the supersessionism. Can you describe that, since most of my audience probably doesn't understand it?
The Christian faith is basically rooted in Judaism, but there's this notion that somehow it has replaced the Jewish people as the vessel of how God is going to work his purposes for humanity. And what happens is this notion that somehow that the Jewish people no longer have any reason to exist in light of the arrival of Jesus Christ, his crucifixion and his resurrection. And there's this notion that the Jewish people really have been forgotten by God and no longer have a role to play in history. And as a result, their state itself really is illegitimate because the Jewish people should have disappeared long ago. And unfortunately, even in those churches that have condemned supersessionism, sometimes I wonder if there isn't a vestige of supersessionism at work, because anytime the Jewish people do anything to defend themselves, these churches overreact, and they are more offended by Jewish self-defense than Islamist hostility towards the Jews.
Do you think that the theology or the philosophy of supersessionism has increased as a result of Israel being reborn?
I don't know. I think we spent, and here I am kind of being a hypocrite, but Christians sure do spend an awful lot of time thinking about the Jews. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why I have a job. Okay, to be frank, but I think that there's an obsession with Israel that is untold. And I think it's going to be very difficult for Christians to ever just think about the Jewish people as if they are just any other people group on the planet. I think that's the difficulty. And so, do I think it's increased or decreased? I think maybe, but I don't think it's ever going to completely disappear, and there are going to be periods of history when things are difficult and people are going to obsess about the Jews.
I see, at least, I don't get that much involved in these discussions because obviously I don't come from that background, but on at least a couple of occasions I've looked at the arguments given, like the Church of Scotland document that was recent. And I don't know if they're considered supersessionists, but they're clearly trying to quote the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, in order to justify what they're doing, even though it makes no sense. So I'm trying to understand that.
And I think the difficulty that Christians have is that we should look at the Hebrew Scriptures as a map to our own soul, and we shouldn't use them just as a millstone to place around the neck of the Jewish people. If we're going to use the Hebrew Scriptures to assess and interrogate Jewish behavior. Okay, well then why don't we do the same thing to assess Muslim behavior as well? And because, quite simply, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we're going to hold up these scriptures and say, you're doing it wrong, well then we need to say the same thing to Israel's adversaries as well. And for example, the security barrier is portrayed as some sort of blight on the Holy Land. Well, isn't suicide bombing a blight on the Holy Land as well, don't you think? That would be my question.
That's a very good point. I don't know if you heard of these guys, and I'm not sure if this is that important a topic, because the only other time I ever got into, or at least tried to argue with these guys, in 2011, these two people that were called Christian ethicists, David Gushee and Glenn Stassen.
Yeah.
I don't know. They came out with this blog post really that said that based on Genesis 15, the Holy Land really should belong to the Muslims because they're also children of Abraham. And it was the most ridiculous thing, because even at first I was looking at the other thing, well, what do you do about the other promises? Then I even looked at Genesis 15, I'm saying, it's talking about 400 years of slavery, and it's clearly talking about Jews. Well, how can you not see that? And they never answered me back. Is this, again,
well, you see, what they were trying to do is, and this is the thing, is that their beef was with the Christian Zionists.
Right.
And so anytime they offend Jews, that's collateral damage, okay? Mm-hmm. And the beef within Christianity is how are Christians supposed to regard the Jewish people? And one of the interesting things is that there are a large number of Christians who will basically raise issues related to Christian Zionism and basically accuse them of Judaizing and basically reverting the Christian faith back to a pre-Christ understanding of the land and of the promises. But the problem is that they, at the same time, they don't really seem to be all that offended by Islamist hostility towards Jews.
Right.
So they're offended by Christian love of the Jewish people that is rooted in Scripture. But they're not really all that offended, and they don't express or exhibit much offense about Islamist hostility towards Jews, which is rooted in another Scripture. And so my attitude is, at what point are you really going to play it straight and deal with all of the issues? Because the problem is not Christian Zionist support for Israel. It's the fact that people hate Jews and want to deprive them of or exercise a veto over their sovereignty that is the problem.
Was Sabeel the first group that that really tried to concretize this anti-Israel attitude within Christianity?
There had been Arab Christians previously, particularly after the Six-Day War, and I think even prior to that, they had always basically, one of the things, the dhimmi Christian populations in the Middle East, one card that they could always play was anti-Semitism, because Muslim doctrine about the Jews and Christian doctrine about the Jews dovetail quite nicely. And so, if you were a Christian living in a Muslim-majority environment, the one thing that you could always do is to basically lay off the hostility that you might have experienced from the Muslim majority back onto the Jews. And so that had been going on for a long time, and I think ultimately that was what Sabeel had done. They weren't but they were the first, to be fair, I think your question, they were like the first organized group that really hammered away at that in a systematic way. And they have always emphasized, gone after Christians who have supported Israel as basically countering or contradicting Christianity's universalist message. And basically trying to portray them almost as if they were Jews within Christianity. That's really the message that they've given.
Do you find that Christians that are Israeli citizens follow more of the Palestinian narrative, or more of or they're a bit more pro-Israel?
Well, right now what we have seen is that there's a fair number of Christians in the Galilee have actually started to sign up for service in the Israeli Defense Forces. And the anti-Zionist Palestinian Christians and the Palestinians in general have been outraged by this. And I think what we are seeing is that, some of them will actually express antagonism towards Israel. For example, like Elias Shakur, or previously, Hilarion Capucci, who was a Melkite bishop in Jerusalem. They, would hammer on Israel left, right, and center. But I think the lay people, I think they understand that their safety is largely tied up with the success of the Jewish state. And they know that. And I think that we're going to see, I think, more expressions of support for Israel, because I think Christians are starting, they see what is happening in the Arab Spring.
Sure. Would you say that a lot of them have essentially a dhimmi attitude?
Well, yeah. And the thing is, this is something that Mark Dury has written about. He's an Anglican priest from Australia. That's a very powerful mindset to get out from under, because it's one of these things that you will, if your parents if you were a Christian and you have lived and your parents lived in a Muslim majority environment, they have embraced habits of mind that have allowed them to survive in a very hostile environment. And what has happened is that those habits of mind can be passed on from generation to generation, almost as if it's a curse. And and you and I might understand this more in psychological terms, but when you really look at it, a curse is in fact a very effective way to get at what the dhimmi attitude is. It's a worldview that basically portrays you as, or that makes you feel that you lack the resources necessary to defend yourself, and that essentially it makes you be thankful to your oppressor for not killing you.
Would you think the Copts fit under that? Because it looks like to an extent they seem to be a bit more assertive.
I think they're struggling with that. There are, and you have to have some sympathy for the Coptic Christians who live in Egypt and also here in the United States. I think they're getting out from under it, that curse or that dhimmi attitude, largely because the percentages have gotten so narrow for them that it doesn't work anymore to be submissive. Coptic Christians here in the United States, many of them have relatives living in Egypt, and they are frightened and they don't really want to speak openly about what's happening because they're afraid that people are going to take out what they say on the Christians still living in Egypt. And I have come across the same attitude with Assyrian or Iraqi Christians as well. And it's troublesome, but I think that's why it's important for people outside these communities to raise the issue, so that people can say, look, it wasn't us, it was those evangelical Protestants, and we don't have anything to do with it.
When you speak to Christian groups, how receptive are they to when you talk about like Christian persecution from Arabs in the Middle East?
Well, a lot of them have never even heard the word dhimmi. Mm-hmm. I remember the number of times I've gotten in front of audiences and I said, how many people here have heard the word dhimmi? And you and I know what dhimmi is. Dhimmi is used to describe non-Muslims who are subject people living in a Muslim majority environment. When you ask people about that, they've never heard of it. And the second you tell them about it and the jurisprudence that underlies dhimmi status or dhimmitude, their eyes get big, and their question is, why haven't we been told this before? Mm-hmm. And the first time I heard of it was at the end of 2004. That was 3 years after September 11th. And you would think that the people who are responsible for educating us about the realities of what life is like in the Middle East studies people, the Islamic studies people, you would think that they would have said, okay, there are some things you need to know. But the effort to basically educate people has been monumentally difficult, and anybody that would raise these issues is described as an Islamophobe. But in my day-to-day dealings with people who have not been educated beyond their ability to comprehend, they want to know more. They're like, what, I walk my dog in the city of Boston. Okay, I live in Boston, and you know the people who have dogs, or they all know each other. You know, they meet in parks and they talk while their dogs play. I had a conversation with some of the people, and they asked me about my work, and I told them about this, and they looked at me and they said, "We've never heard of this before." And these people are not dumb. Sure. It's just that they haven't been told. Mm-hmm. So I think over the long haul, people are increasingly receptive. And the message that I say is that Christians in the Middle East are paying for our tuition with their lives and blood. And that's an unfortunate thing to say, but I think that's the truth.
Is there any message that you would like to give out, like or your main message you when you speak to people?
Well, you know, I guess right now I'm on a kick that I think people should really, you know, and part of it is that I just read Yoram Hazony's book, The Dawn, which is about the book of Esther. And I think that Christians can learn an awful lot about what their obligations are. The book of Esther basically tells the story, you know it probably better than I do, about how, you know, two Jews, Esther and Mordecai, basically achieved the salvation of their people in some very dire circumstances. And that's, I think, Christians oftentimes, you know, don't understand that as a people of God, they may end up, they have to learn these lessons as well. What are they going to do? They have a responsibility to promote the continued survival of their community as well. And my message to Christians in the United States is do not be cowed into silence. And I'm going to borrow this from Mark Dury. You know, Muslim scriptures, the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah, the Muslim sources say some very specific things about how Christians are supposed to be treated. And we have a right and an obligation to address those things in interfaith dialogue and amongst ourselves. We have a right to talk about those things. And accusations of Islamophobia are not going to cut it anymore. So I guess that's my message.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elva.